The desert wind carried whispers of danger across the Arizona Territory in 1882, and Margaret Whitmore pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching the endless expanse of red earth stretch toward the horizon. Her husband's mining operation had brought them to this God-forsaken place, where Apache raids were as common as tumbleweeds, and where a woman's safety hung by the thinnest of threads. She had begged Thomas to take her back to Boston, but his eyes held only the glint of silver ore and the promise of fortune. 3 months ago, the Hendersons' ranch had been attacked just 15 miles south, leaving behind only charred remains and haunting memories that kept the entire territory on edge. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from in the comments below. Margaret's fingers traced the delicate lace of her morning dress as she remembered the conversation that had changed everything. Thomas had stormed into their modest adobe home the previous evening, his face flushed with whiskey and determination. "I've hired protection," he had announced, loosening his collar with trembling hands. "An Apache tracker. Best in the territory, they say. He'll keep you safe while I'm at the mines." The irony wasn't lost on her, hiring one Apache to protect against others. But Thomas was a practical man, and practical men made practical decisions, even when those decisions defied conventional wisdom. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention back to the window. A lone rider emerged from the morning haze, sitting tall on a paint horse that moved with the fluid grace of water flowing over stone. Even from a distance, she could see the distinctive silhouette, long black hair flowing freely, bronze skin that seemed to absorb the desert sun, and a bearing that spoke of ancient pride and untamed wilderness. This had to be him. This had to be the man who would shadow her every move, who would stand between her and the dangers that lurked in every canyon and behind every mesa. As the rider drew closer, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had expected someone older, perhaps weathered by years of conflict and hardship. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who couldn't be more than 30, with features that seemed carved from the very landscape itself, strong, angular, and impossibly handsome. His dark eyes swept the area with the practiced efficiency of a predator, missing nothing, cataloging every potential threat and escape route. When those eyes briefly met hers through the window, she felt something stirred deep within her chest, something she hadn't felt since the early days of her marriage to Thomas. The Apache dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful. He wore traditional buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt that had seen better days. But there was nothing primitive about his bearing. This was a man who commanded respect through presence alone, who had survived in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. Margaret watched as he secured his horse and approached the house, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Thomas emerged from his study, adjusting his vest and putting on the authoritative air he wore like armor when dealing with what he considered lesser people. "You must be Ayanna," Thomas said, extending his hand in a gesture that was more dismissive than welcoming. The Apache regarded the offered hand for a moment before accepting it with a grip that made Thomas wince slightly. "I am," came the reply, his voice carrying the subtle accent of someone who had learned English as a second language, but spoke it with careful precision. "I understand you need protection for your woman." The directness of the statement seemed to catch Thomas off guard, and Margaret noticed how her husband's chest puffed out slightly at the implied challenge to his ability to protect his own wife. Margaret descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the rough wooden banister as she studied the man who would now be responsible for her safety. Up close, Ayanna was even more striking than she had imagined. His face bore the high cheekbones and strong jaw typical of his people, but his eyes held an intelligence and depth that spoke of someone who had walked between two worlds and found his place in neither. When he looked at her, she felt as though he could see straight through to her soul, past the carefully constructed facade of the dutiful wife to the woman who yearned for something more than the suffocating predictability of her current existence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ayanna said, inclining his head slightly in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and somehow intimate. "I will keep you safe." The simple statement carried the weight of an oath, and Margaret found herself believing him completely. There was something about this man that inspired confidence, a quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself with bluster or bravado. Thomas, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrent of tension in the room, launched into a detailed explanation of Margaret's daily routine, the threats they faced, and his expectations for her protection. As the days passed, Margaret found herself looking forward to Ayanna's presence with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. He was a shadow that never left her side, always positioned where he could see potential threats while remaining unobtrusive enough not to interfere with her daily activities. When she tended her small garden behind the house, he sat in the shade of the ramada, his dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon. When she walked to the general store in town, he followed at a respectful distance, his presence causing whispers and nervous glances from the other townspeople who had never seen an Apache moving freely among them. The first real conversation between them came on a Tuesday morning when Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. A dust devil had formed in the distance, spinning across the desert floor like a dancing spirit, and she found herself mesmerized by its graceful movement. "In my language, we call that a ghost dancer," Ayanna said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the small space between them. "The spirits of our ancestors, reminding us that they still watch over the land." Margaret turned to look at him, surprised by the poetry in his words and the gentle sadness that seemed to underlie them. "Do you miss it?" she asked, gesturing toward the vast expanse of desert that stretched beyond their small settlement. "The old ways, I mean, the four." She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence without causing offense. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against the azure sky. "A man cannot miss what was never truly his to lose," he said finally. "But yes, I remember when the land spoke in voices we understood, when the seasons changed according to rhythms older than memory. Now the land speaks in the language of mining claims and railroad surveys." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a profound acceptance that spoke of someone who had made peace with forces beyond his control. Margaret found herself drawn to this quiet wisdom, so different from Thomas's constant need to dominate and control everything around him. As the weeks passed, their conversations became longer and more intimate, touching on subjects that ranged from the changing face of the territory to the books Margaret had brought from Boston. She discovered that Ayanna could read English as well as speak it, a skill he had acquired during a brief period at a mission school before returning to his people. The turning point came during the third week of his employment, when a group of drifters rode into town with trouble written in every line of their dust-covered faces. Margaret had been shopping for supplies when the men entered the general store, their eyes immediately fixing on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Well, well," the leader drawled, his voice thick with whiskey and malicious intent. "What have we here? A pretty little flower blooming in the desert." His companions laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made Margaret's blood run cold. She had started to back toward the door when Ayanna appeared, as if materializing from thin air, his presence filling the doorway like a gathering storm. The drifters' laughter died abruptly as they took in his imposing figure, the way he held himself with the coiled tension of a predator ready to strike. "The lady is under my protection," he said quietly, his voice carrying a deadly calm that was more threatening than any shout could have been. The leader of the group, a man with scarred hands and cruel eyes, sneered and reached for his gun, but found himself staring down the barrel of Ayanna's rifle before his fingers could close around the grip. "I suggest you finish your business and move on," Ayanna continued, his tone never changing from that same deadly calm. "This town has no need for your kind of trouble." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the leader raised his hands slowly, his eyes never leaving Ayanna's face. "No trouble here, Apache," he said, though the hatred in his voice was unmistakable. "We were just leaving." The group filed out of the store, but not before the leader cast one last, venomous look at both Margaret and her protector. That evening, as Margaret sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, she found herself unable to stop thinking about the way Ayanna had appeared when she needed him most. It was as though he had sensed her distress across the distance, as though some invisible thread connected them that transcended the normal boundaries between protector and protected. When he emerged from the shadows, where he had been keeping watch, she gestured for him to join her on the porch, an invitation that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances, but felt perfectly natural in the isolation of their desert home. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying all the gratitude she couldn't quite put into words. "For today, I mean. For everything." Ayanna settled onto the porch steps, maintaining a respectful distance while still being close enough for conversation. "It is what I am paid to do," he replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested his motivations went deeper than mere financial obligation. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Each lost in thoughts they couldn't quite bring themselves to voice. "Tell me about your family," Margaret said eventually, surprising herself with the personal nature of the question. Ayanna was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer, but finally he began to speak in a voice so low she had to strain to hear him. "I had a wife once," he said, his words carrying the weight of old grief. "She died in the winter of 1879, along with our son. Soldiers came to our camp, said we were harboring raiders. They were wrong, but by the time the truth was known, it was too late." The simple statement contained a universe of pain, and Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she imagined the loss this man had endured. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate in the face of such profound grief. Ayanna turned to look at her then, and in the fading light, she could see the depth of sorrow that lived behind his dark eyes. "The dead are gone," he said quietly, "but the living must continue to live. It is the way of things." There was acceptance in his voice, but also a loneliness that resonated with something deep in Margaret's own heart. She had never lost a child, but she understood the ache of unfulfilled dreams, the weight of a life that felt somehow incomplete. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Margaret and Ayanna deepened in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. She found herself looking forward to their conversations with an eagerness that had nothing to do with mere politeness and everything to do with a growing attraction she couldn't deny. He told her stories of his people, of the old ways and the new struggles, painting pictures with words that transported her to a world she had never imagined. In return, she shared her own stories, her childhood in Boston, her dreams of travel and adventure, the slow suffocation of a marriage that had become more obligation than love. Thomas, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the growing connection between his wife and her protector, too consumed with his mining operation to notice the subtle changes in Margaret's demeanor. She smiled more often now, carried herself with a confidence that hadn't been there before, and seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the desert sun. When he was home, which was increasingly rare, he spoke only of ore samples and profit margins, his conversation as dry and lifeless as the desert wind. The crisis that would change everything came on a scorching afternoon in late summer, when a band of renegade Apaches attacked a supply wagon just 5 miles from town. The territorial militia was called out, and every able-bodied man was expected to join the pursuit, including Thomas. "I can't leave Margaret alone," he protested when the call came, but the sheriff was insistent. "She's got that Apache watching over her," he pointed out. "Best protection she could have. Considering the circumstances, we need every gun we can get." So Thomas rode out with the militia, leaving Margaret alone with Ayanna for the first time since his employment had begun. The house felt different without Thomas's presence, more intimate somehow, as though the walls themselves had drawn closer together. Margaret found herself acutely aware of every sound Ayanna made, every movement he took as he went about his duties. When evening came, and he took his usual position on the porch, she made a decision that would have shocked her former self. She brought him coffee and sat beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Are you afraid?" she asked, referring to the renegades who were still somewhere in the territory. Ayanna considered the question seriously before answering. "Fear is a luxury I cannot afford," he said finally. "But I am concerned. These men, they are desperate. Desperate men do desperate things." He paused, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the porch. "If they come here, you must promise me something. You must promise that you will do exactly as I say, without question or hesitation. Your life may depend on it." Margaret nodded, struck by the gravity in his voice. "I promise," she said, and meant it completely. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them like a physical presence. Finally, Margaret found the courage to voice what had been growing in her heart for weeks. "Ayanna," she said, softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to know what I feel for you. It's not gratitude. It's not the simple affection of a woman for her protector. It's something more, something I've never felt before, not even with Thomas." The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous and beautiful and utterly irreversible. Ayanna turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight, and she could see her own feelings mirrored there. "Margaret," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "You are married. You are not mine to love." But even as he spoke the words, his hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the porch railing, his touch sending electricity through her entire body. "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I know it's wrong. I know it's impossible. But I can't help what I feel. I can't help loving you." The words were out now, hanging between them like a bridge that once crossed could never be uncrossed. Ayana's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand, and she could feel him trembling with the effort of maintaining control. "In my culture," he said quietly, "we believe that some souls are meant to find each other across many lifetimes. Perhaps in another life, another time, we could have been together without shame or secrecy." His words were beautiful and heartbreaking, acknowledging the love between them while also recognizing the impossibility of their situation. Margaret leaned closer to him, drawn by a force stronger than propriety or fear, and for a moment it seemed as though he might kiss her. But the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders moving fast across the desert floor. Ayana was on his feet instantly, his rifle in his hands, his entire demeanor shifting from tender lover to deadly protector in the space of a heartbeat. "Inside," he commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Lock the doors and stay away from the windows." Margaret obeyed without question, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline as she secured the house and took refuge in the interior hallway. Through the walls, she could hear voices, harsh, demanding, speaking in a mixture of English and Apache that she couldn't fully understand. Ayana's voice rose above the others, calm and measured, but she could hear the steel beneath the silk. The conversation went on for what felt like hours, punctuated by moments of tense silence that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Finally, she heard the sound of departing horses, and after several more minutes, Ayana's voice calling her name. She emerged from the house to find him standing in the yard, his rifle still in his hands, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of lingering threat. "They're gone," he said simply, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. "What did they want?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "You," he replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "They know about the mining operation, about Thomas's success. They think you would make valuable leverage." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just in danger from random raiders or desperate men. She was a specific target, a prize to be claimed and used against her husband. "What did you tell them?" she asked, though he wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Ayana's jaw tightened, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. "I told them that you were under the protection of Ayana of the Chiricahua, and that any man who touched you would answer to me with his life." The formal way he spoke his own name, the ancient pride that rang in his voice, sent shivers down Margaret's spine. This was not just her gentle protector speaking. This was a warrior of a proud people, a man who had faced death and emerged victorious more times than she could imagine. "Will they come back?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yes," he said simply, "but not tonight. Tonight they will plan and prepare. Tomorrow—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. That night, Margaret lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that sleep would be impossible. Every sound seemed magnified. The wind through the eaves, the settling of the house, the distant call of a coyote. But underneath it all, She was aware of Ayana's presence, knew that he was out there in the darkness, watching and waiting, ready to give his life to protect hers. The knowledge filled her with a mixture of gratitude and guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. When dawn finally broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret rose and dressed with unusual care, as though she were preparing for some momentous occasion. In a way, she supposed she was. Today would bring the confrontation that had been building since the moment Ayana had first arrived at their door. And she had the feeling that nothing would ever be the same afterward. She found him on the porch, exactly where she had expected, his rifle across his knees, and his eyes fixed on the horizon. He looked as though he hadn't slept at all, but there was no weariness in his bearing, only the coiled alertness of a predator waiting for the hunt to begin. "Good morning," she said softly, settling beside him with a cup of coffee that she had prepared more from habit than hunger. "They will come with the sun," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had lived this scenario before. "How many?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "6, maybe 7, enough to be confident, not so many as to be unwieldy." He turned to look at her then, and she could see something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not fear exactly, but a deep sadness that seemed to encompass more than just their current situation. "Margaret," he said, her name carrying a weight of unspoken emotion. "There is something you must understand. When they come, I will do everything in my power to protect you. But if the worst happens, if I fall—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed too large for his throat. "You must not let them take you alive. Do you understand what I am saying?" The implication of his words hit her like a physical blow, and she felt the blood drain from her face. "Don't talk like that," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You won't fall. You can't." But even as she spoke the words, she knew that he was right to prepare her for the possibility. He was one man against many, and while his skills were formidable, he was not invincible. The thought of losing him, of facing a world without his quiet strength and gentle wisdom, was almost more than she could bear. Ayana reached into his shirt and withdrew a small knife, its blade gleaming in the morning light. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hands. "If the time comes, you will know what to do." Margaret stared at the weapon, its weight seeming to encompass all the terrible possibilities that lay ahead. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. But Ayana's hand covered hers, warm and strong and infinitely reassuring. "You are stronger than you know," he said quietly. "Stronger than this place, stronger than the fear, stronger than the men who would use you for their own ends. Remember that, no matter what happens." His words filled her with a courage she hadn't known she possessed, and she found herself nodding, accepting the responsibility he was placing on her shoulders. The attack came just after noon, when the sun was at its highest point and the heat shimmered off the desert floor like water. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard the first shot, followed immediately by Ayana's voice shouting for her to get down. She dropped to the floor, behind the heavy wooden table, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it would burst from her chest. Through the window, she could see riders circling the house, their faces painted for war, their voices raised in the ancient battle cries of their people. But it was Ayana who commanded her attention, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural as he darted from cover to cover, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. She watched in fascination and terror as he dropped one attacker, then another, his movements economical and precise. This was not the gentle man who had shared stories with her on the porch. This was a warrior in his element, deadly and beautiful and utterly magnificent. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sound of gunfire echoing off the surrounding hills like thunder. Margaret clutched the knife Ayanna had given her, her knuckles white with the force of her grip, and prayed to whatever gods might be listening for his safety. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the violence that had preceded it. "Margaret!" Ayanna's voice called from outside, and she nearly wept with relief at the sound. She emerged from her hiding place to find him standing in the yard, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder, but very much alive. Around him lay the bodies of their attackers, testament to his skill and determination. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury, and she shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Without thinking, she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck and holding him close, not caring about the blood or the impropriety or anything else except the fact that he was alive and safe. For a moment, he stood rigid in her embrace, but then his arms came around her, holding her with a desperate intensity that spoke of his own relief and fear. "I thought I had lost you," she whispered against his neck, and she felt him shudder at her words. "Never," he said fiercely, his voice rough with emotion. "I will never let anything happen to you." They stood there in the aftermath of violence, holding each other as though they could somehow merge into one being. And Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she loved this man more than life itself. The knowledge should have terrified her, should have filled her with guilt and shame, but instead, it filled her with a peace she had never known. It was the sound of approaching hoofbeats that finally broke them apart, and Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of Thomas's horse. Her husband appeared over the rise, leading the returning militia, his face a mask of concern that quickly shifted to confusion as he took in the scene before him. The bodies of the attackers, the blood on Ayanna's shirt, his wife standing far too close to her protector. It all painted a picture that Thomas's suspicious mind was quick to interpret. "What happened here?" he demanded, dismounting and striding toward them with the aggressive posture of a man asserting his dominance. Ayanna stepped slightly away from Margaret, his face resuming the impassive mask he wore when dealing with her husband, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. "Renegades," he said simply. "7 of them. They came for your wife." His words were factual and emotionless, but Thomas's eyes narrowed as he studied the scene more carefully. 7 men, Thomas repeated, his voice heavy with skepticism. "And you killed them all, by yourself?" There was an accusation in his tone that made Margaret's blood boil, an implication that somehow Ayanna was lying or exaggerating his role in her protection. "He saved my life," she said firmly, stepping forward to stand beside her protector. If he hadn't been here, she let the sentence hang, allowing Thomas to draw his own conclusions about what might have happened. But Thomas's attention had shifted to something else, something that made his face darken with a rage that Margaret had never seen before. Following his gaze, she realized with horror that he was staring at the knife in her hand, the one Ayanna had given her for protection. In the aftermath of the attack, she had forgotten she was still holding it. But now its presence seemed to glow like a beacon of guilt. "And what," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is my wife doing with an Apache weapon?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet. She could see the suspicion in her husband's eyes, the ugly thoughts that were forming in his mind, and she knew that their secret was about to be exposed in the worst possible way. "I gave it to her," Ayanna said calmly, stepping slightly forward as though to shield Margaret from her husband's wrath. "For protection, in case I fell in battle. It is the duty of a protector to ensure his charge has every possible means of defense." His explanation was logical and reasonable, but Margaret could see that Thomas wasn't buying it. Her husband's face had taken on the mottled red color that she had learned to associate with his worst rages. "How very thorough of you," Thomas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose you also taught her how to use it? Spent long hours in close instruction?" The implication in his words was unmistakable, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of shame and anger. How dare he reduce what she and Ayanna shared to something sordid and cheap? "Thomas, please," she began, but he cut her off with a gesture that was both dismissive and threatening. "I think," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "that your services are no longer required here. You can collect your pay from my foreman and be gone by sunset." The dismissal was brutal in its finality, and Margaret felt her heart break at the thought of losing Ayanna, just when she had found him. "You can't do this," she protested, her voice rising with desperation. "He just saved my life. He's the only reason I'm still alive." But Thomas's expression remained implacable, his decision clearly final. "What I can and cannot do with my own wife and my own property is not open for discussion," he said coldly. "The Apache has done his job. Now it's time for him to go." Margaret looked at Ayanna, hoping to see some sign of resistance, some indication that he would fight for what they had found together. But his face had resumed the stoic mask she had first seen, and she realized with a sinking heart that he would not challenge Thomas's authority. In his world, a man's word was his bond, and he had been hired to protect her, not to steal her away from her husband. "I understand," Ayanna said quietly, his voice betraying none of the emotion she knew he must be feeling. "I will gather my things." He turned to go, but then paused and looked back at Margaret, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that look, she saw everything he couldn't say: his love, his regret, his promise that he would never forget what they had shared. As he walked away, Margaret felt something die inside her chest, some essential part of herself that she knew would never be whole again. Thomas was speaking, saying something about the need to maintain proper boundaries and the dangers of becoming too familiar with the hired help, but his words seemed to come from very far away. All she could think about was the man walking away from her, taking her heart with him into the desert. That evening, as the sun set over the Arizona territory, in a blaze of gold and crimson, Margaret stood at her bedroom window and watched Ayanna ride away. He sat tall in the saddle, his back straight and proud, never once looking back at the house that had been his home for the past 3 months. She pressed her hand against the glass, wishing she could somehow reach across the distance and touch him one more time, tell him that what they had shared was real and precious and worth any sacrifice. But he was gone, disappearing into the desert like a mirage, and she was left alone with a husband who looked at her now with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. Thomas had made it clear that he blamed her for what he saw as an inappropriate relationship with their protector, and she knew that her life would never be the same. The freedom she had tasted, the joy she had found in Ayana's company, was now just a memory that she would carry with her like a secret treasure. Days passed in a blur of strained silences and careful politeness. Thomas hired new guards, rough men from town, who looked at her with a mixture of desire and disdain that made her skin crawl. They were nothing like Ayana. They had no grace, no wisdom, no gentle strength that made her feel safe and cherished. They were simply hired guns, doing a job for pay, and she felt their absence of care like a physical ache. But it was at night that the loss hit her hardest, when she lay in her bed, listening to the desert wind and remembering the sound of Ayana's voice as he told her stories of his people. She would close her eyes and try to recapture the feeling of safety she had known when he was near, the sense that someone in the world truly understood and valued her. But the memories were already beginning to fade, becoming as insubstantial as the desert mirages that danced on the horizon. 3 weeks after Ayana's departure, Margaret received news that changed everything. A rider brought word that Thomas's mine had collapsed, trapping him and several workers underground. The rescue efforts would take days, and there was no guarantee that anyone would be found alive. As she stood in her kitchen, holding the telegram that might have just made her a widow, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions that she couldn't quite untangle. If Thomas was dead, she would be free. Free to leave this place. Free to make her own choices. Free to find Ayana and tell him that nothing stood between them anymore. But the thought of her husband dying alone in the darkness, perhaps calling her name with his last breath, filled her with a guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. Whatever their marriage had become, he had been a good man once, and he deserved better than to die unmourned and unloved. The days that followed were a nightmare of waiting and uncertainty. Margaret maintained a vigil at the mine site, bringing food and coffee to the rescue workers, offering what comfort she could to the families of the other trapped men. But her thoughts kept drifting to Ayana, wondering where he was, whether he had heard the news, whether he would come to her if he knew she might soon be free. On the 4th day, the rescuers broke through to the trapped section of the mine. Thomas was alive, barely, his body broken, but his spirit intact. As Margaret sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand and listening to his labored breathing, she realized that her dreams of freedom had been just that, dreams. Thomas would recover, eventually, and she would remain his wife, bound by duty and obligation to a man she could never love the way she loved Ayana. But as she sat there in the dim hospital room, Margaret made a decision that would have shocked her former self. She would not spend the rest of her life in quiet desperation, mourning what might have been. She would find a way to see Ayana again, to tell him that her feelings hadn't changed, that she would wait for him no matter how long it took. Love like theirs was too precious to abandon without a fight, and she was done being the passive victim of other people's decisions. The opportunity came sooner than she had expected. Thomas's recovery would take months, and the doctor recommended that he be moved to a hospital in Tucson where he could receive better care. Margaret volunteered to accompany him, but Thomas, perhaps feeling guilty about his treatment of her, insisted that she remain at the ranch. "You've been through enough," he said, his voice weak but determined. "Stay here, rest, recover from all this trauma. I'll be back before you know it." So Margaret found herself alone at the ranch. With only the hired guards for protection and all the freedom in the world to make her own choices. She waited exactly 1 day after Thomas's departure before saddling her horse and riding out into the desert, following the trails that Ayana had shown her during their long conversations about the land and its secrets. She had no clear plan, no idea where she might find him, but something deep in her heart told her that if she looked hard enough, their paths would cross again. She found him 3 days later, camped beside a small spring in a canyon that seemed to exist outside of time itself. He was sitting by a small fire, his back to her, but she knew he had heard her approach long before she came into view. When he turned to look at her, his face showed no surprise, only a deep sadness that seemed to encompass all the pain of their separation. "You should not have come," he said quietly. But there was no real conviction in his voice. Margaret dismounted and walked toward him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. "Thomas is in Tucson," she said simply. "He'll be there for months. We have time." The words hung between them like a bridge, an invitation to step back into the world they had created together, if only for a little while. Ayana stood slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "And when he returns?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. "When he returns, I'll deal with whatever comes," Margaret replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "But I won't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. I won't let fear rob me of the only real happiness I've ever known." For a long moment, they stood there in the fading light, two people balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Then Ayana stepped forward and took her hands in his touch sending electricity through her entire body. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once we cross this line, there will be no going back." Margaret looked into his dark eyes, seeing her own love reflected there, and knew that she had never been more certain of anything in her life. "I'm certain," she said, and then she was in his arms. Finally, completely, kissing him with all the passion and longing that had been building between them for months. The kiss was everything she had dreamed it would be and more. Tender and fierce, desperate and gentle. A perfect expression of the love that had grown between them against all odds. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ayana rested his forehead against hers and smiled. The first truly joyful expression she had ever seen on his face. "Then we will have this time," he said softly. "However long it lasts, we will have this." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, Margaret knew that whatever the future held, she would never regret this moment, this choice, this love that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Margaret's life. She and Ayana created a world of their own in the hidden places of the desert, far from the judgment and expectations of civilization. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears and stories that bound them together more surely than any marriage vows. He taught her to read the signs of the desert, to find water in the most unlikely places, to move through the landscape like a ghost. She shared with him the books she had brought from Boston, reading aloud by firelight, while he listened with the attention of someone discovering a new world. But underneath their happiness lay the constant awareness that their time was borrowed, that eventually Thomas would return and their dream would have to end. They never spoke of it directly, but Margaret could see the shadow of that knowledge in Ayana's eyes, the way he sometimes looked at her as though he were trying to memorize every detail of her face. She understood, because she was doing the same thing, storing up memories against the long loneliness that lay ahead. The end came, as they had both known it would, with a telegram delivered by a rider who had tracked them to their hidden canyon. Thomas was recovering faster than expected and would be returning within the week. Margaret read the message twice, her hands trembling, before passing it to Ayanna. He read it in silence, his face resuming the stoic mask she had learned to hate. "It's time," he said simply, and she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They packed their few belongings in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they were leaving behind. As they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Ayanna took her hands one last time, his touch gentle and infinitely precious. "I want you to know," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "that these weeks with you have been the greatest gift of my life. Whatever happens now, whatever the future holds, I will carry the memory of this time with me always." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but she managed to smile through them. "And I want you to know," she replied, "that you have shown me what love really is. You have given me a piece of myself that I never knew existed. And no one can ever take that away." They kissed then, one last time, pouring all their love and longing and regret into that final embrace. When they returned to the ranch, they resumed their former roles as though nothing had changed. Margaret became once again the dutiful wife, preparing for her husband's return, while Ayanna melted back into the shadows, watching over her from a distance. To any observer, they were simply what they had always appeared to be, a woman and her protector, bound by duty rather than desire. Thomas returned 3 days later, still weak, but determined to resume control of his life and property. He greeted Margaret with a perfunctory kiss and immediately launched into plans for expanding the mining operation, apparently having forgotten his suspicions about her relationship with Ayanna in the face of his own near-death experience. For her part, Margaret played the role of the concerned wife, listening to his stories and plans with apparent interest while her heart remained in the desert with the man she truly loved. But their careful charade couldn't last forever. Thomas might have been distracted by his business concerns, but he wasn't blind, and eventually he began to notice the subtle changes in his wife's demeanor. She was different somehow, more confident, more self-possessed, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. When he looked at her, he sometimes caught glimpses of a secret knowledge in her eyes, a sense that she was living in a world he couldn't access. The confrontation came on a hot afternoon in late summer, when Thomas returned unexpectedly from the mine to find Margaret and Ayanna standing together in the garden, their heads bent over a book she had been reading to him. There was nothing overtly improper about the scene, but something in their posture, in the way they stood just a little too close together, set off every alarm in Thomas's suspicious mind. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that Margaret had learned to fear. She looked up from the book, her face carefully composed, but she could see that Ayanna had tensed beside her, ready for whatever might come. "I was just reading to Ayanna," she said calmly. "He's interested in learning about literature." It was the truth, but not the whole truth, and they all knew it. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he studied them both, looking for some sign of the betrayal he was certain had taken place. "How educational," he said finally, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose these reading lessons have been going on for some time." Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Education is never wasted," she replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. But Thomas had seen enough. The way his wife looked at her protector, the way the Apache's eyes softened when he looked at her, it all painted a picture that confirmed his worst suspicions. "I think," he said slowly, "that it's time for a change. Ayanna, your services are no longer required. You have 1 hour to collect your belongings and leave my property." The dismissal was final and absolute, and Margaret felt her world crumble around her. "Thomas, please," she began, but he cut her off with a gesture that was both dismissive and threatening. "The decision is made," he said coldly. "And Margaret, you will go inside and remain there until he is gone. I don't want to see you speaking to him again." Margaret looked at Ayanna, hoping to see some sign of resistance, some indication that he would fight for what they had found together. But his face had resumed the impassive mask she knew so well, and she realized that he would not challenge Thomas's authority. In his world, honor meant accepting the consequences of one's choices, even when those consequences were unbearable. "I understand," Ayanna said quietly, his voice betraying none of the emotion she knew he must be feeling. He turned to go, but then paused and looked back at Margaret, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that look, she saw everything he couldn't say, his love, his regret, his promise that he would never forget what they had shared. As he walked away for the second time, Margaret felt something break inside her chest, some essential part of herself that she knew would never heal. Thomas was speaking, saying something about the need to maintain proper boundaries and the dangers of becoming too familiar with the hired help. But his words seemed to come from very far away. All she could think about was the man walking away from her, taking her heart with him into the desert once again. But this time, Margaret made a different choice. As Ayanna reached his horse and began to secure his few belongings, she broke away from Thomas and ran after him, her skirts flying behind her like wings. "Wait!" she called, her voice carrying across the desert air. "Please, wait!" Ayanna turned, his face showing surprise and something that might have been hope. "I can't let you go again," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I can't spend the rest of my life pretending that what we have doesn't matter. I love you, and I don't care who knows it." The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous and beautiful, and utterly irreversible. Behind her, she could hear Thomas shouting, his voice rising with rage and disbelief. But for once in her life, Margaret didn't care what her husband thought or wanted. She had found something precious and real, and she was not going to let it slip away without a fight. Ayanna looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as though trying to read her very soul. Then, slowly, he smiled, that same joyful expression she had seen in their hidden canyon, the one that transformed his entire face and made her heart sing with happiness. "Then come with me," he said simply, extending his hand toward her. "Leave this place, leave this life that makes you unhappy, and come with me into the desert. We can make our own way, create our own world where love matters more than convention." Margaret stared at his outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would mean abandoning everything she had ever known, everything that society said she should value. But as she looked into Ayanna's eyes, she realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was love, real and true and worth any sacrifice. Without hesitation, she placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth of his fingers as they closed around hers. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. "Yes, I'll come with you." And as they mounted his horse together, riding away from the ranch and into the vast freedom of the desert, Margaret knew that she had finally found her true home, not in any place, but in the heart of the man who loved her enough to risk everything for their happiness. Behind them, Thomas's shouts faded into the distance, becoming just another sound in the endless symphony of the desert wind. Ahead lay uncertainty and hardship, but also the promise of a love that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. As the sun set over the Arizona territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret wrapped her arms around Ayana's waist and smiled, knowing that she had finally chosen her own destiny.